Ladies and gentlemen, folks, Krzysztof the Polish Geek welcomes you to a very special video. Possibly the most important video you might ever watch in the history of this channel. Because this is the video, one of those videos actually I very much wanted to make ever since the creation of this channel. Because I'm gonna discuss very in depth the Lord of the Rings trilogy and why it's so magnificent. I mean, I did give it a you should be watching treatment back in 2022 in December actually, but this time I decided to go way more in depth with the Lord of the Rings, because the Lord of the Rings trilogy are my most beloved movies in existence and nothing ever comes close to it. Like, those movies have been with me ever since childhood. I remember watching The Fellowship of the Ring on VHS when I was like 8 years old, and then very soon going to the theaters to see The Two Towers, and then a year later saw The Return of the King, and the trilogy was complete. But then even a year after that, I got the whole box DVD set of the extended editions. So yes, you could basically say I'm one of the veteran fans of that magnificent trilogy. So yes, I already gave it the whole you should be watching treatment, but this time, as I said, we're going way more in depth with what makes those movies so magnificent, so amazing, so special. And it's not like last time where I did my best to avoid spoilers for the lost souls who still haven't seen those masterpieces. This time, we're going all the way through with this, and no spoilers will be spared this time. So, if you haven't seen those movies, then I suggest you leave now. But if you have, or you don't mind any spoilers, and trust me, there will be plenty of them, then let me take you on the journey of the eternal magnificence of the Lord of the Rings trilogy and what makes those movies so special. And by the way, I've read the books as well, but it was much later in my life actually. So yes, we will very much touch on the books and Tolkien's writings as well, because I really love J.R.R Tolkien. I think he's the greatest writer, world builder and storyteller that has ever existed. Because to truly appreciate those movies, yes, you do gotta understand Tolkien's writings. And one more thing, no, we are not even touching the Amazon Rings of Prime or Rings of Plagiarism, as I like to call it, trash. No, we are not gonna bring this even up here. But what makes the Lord of the Rings trilogy so special?
Remember,
the Lord of the Rings movies were created over 20 years ago at this point, but they impressed people back when they came out, and they truly stood a test of time. And even someone who knows very little about filmmaking, or Tolkien lore for that matter, will very much be able to tell that there's just something so special about those movies. I saw those movies back when they came out in theaters actually. As a little kid, I was like 8 years old when I saw Two Towers, and then 9 when I saw Return of the King. And already then, I was just so much deeply in love with those movies and the world of Tolkien and Middle-earth. Like, Return of the King even won 11 Oscars that it was nominated. Like, you hear people saying like, Marvel is dead, Star Wars is dead, etc, and they compared how great Marvel movies were in the past. But well, even the best of Marvel movies look nothing but empty cash grabs just for the sake of special effects when you see a masterpiece like the Lord of the Rings trilogy. All the Marvel movies are certainly fun entertainment to keep moviegoers engaged. And I speak as someone who does love old Marvel movies, but a look at a masterpiece like the Lord of the Rings trilogy, you can truly tell what a truly good quality filmmaking with truly compelling storytelling as well as passion, heart and love truly means. But to truly appreciate how brilliant the Lord of the Rings is, we actually gotta talk way more in depth about it. This is sort of an analysis of both the book and the movie, because to truly understand why those movies are so fantastic and what truly makes them special is also to truly love and understand Tolkien. So first, I will discuss Tolkien and his books and why I think he's the greatest storyteller that has ever lived. And afterwards, I will also talk about the history of how those movies came to be and finally the movies themselves. And it won't be like the last time where I just tried my best to leave out the spoilers. This time we're going all the way through with this. This isn't a recommendation video. It's a deep analysis of Tolkien, Peter Jackson, and why those movies will always be the greatest movies in existence. You probably already know if you are watching my videos because I said it plenty of times in my videos, but I consider J.R.R Tolkien as the greatest storyteller, world builder and writer that has ever lived. He was a World War I veteran, a great smart man who spoke so many languages. He even tried to learn my native Polish, and he was a Roman Catholic like me, and his Catholic faith very much played a role in his writings and The Lord of the Rings. I will briefly touch upon that later though, even though this channel isn't about religion. And I admit, there was a brief short period of time when I thought George R.R. Martin was the greatest storyteller that has ever lived, when Game of Thrones was running largely, but even leaving out the absolute trash of an ending that the show ended up having, you see that without Tolkien, Martin wouldn't have his ideas. Plus, Martin isn't even able to finish his stories, and I doubt he's ever gonna get to this point. But J.R.R. Tolkien is a father of fantasy in what we understand in the modern world. Every single medieval fantasy takes inspiration from Tolkien, including The Witcher, Berserk, Game of Thrones, etc. But they all owe their existence to Tolkien and his creation. Even random fantasy video games such as Dragon Age or Baldur's Gate wouldn't exist without Tolkien and his writings. Tolkien is basically the source. Tolkien created the whole world and lore of Middle-earth before he was writing any of his stories actually set in the Middle-earth, and he planned everything from ground up. His passion and dedication exceeds every single writer and world builder that has ever lived. He even created entirely new languages for his world of Middle-earth. Tolkien initially wanted to just create English mythology, but instead ending up creating an entirely new world that has been studied and beloved by many generations. He took inspiration from a lot of European myths and folklore, especially Norse and Celtic mythology. Those were the two mythologies he chose the most really from. Hence, you have elves, dwarves, goblins, trolls and some others. And Tolkien didn't just copy and paste those creatures, but he gave his own unique spin on them in a way that very much complemented the beautiful world that he created. And of course, he added plenty of things of his own, such as orcs, hobbits and the evil Dark Lord. Now, hobbits and orcs are also seen in plenty of fantasy media, like they are common, as are elves and goblins, but elves and goblins, as I already said, were inspired from previous European myths and folktales, while orcs and hobbits were inventions of Tolkien, even if they now just got accepted as common fantasy races. And the Shire, where the hobbits lived, is based on a small rural English village of Tolkien's time. Even names like Hobbiton, Buckland, etc. are very English-sounding names. Hobbits are regular folks who live like peasants and they love to just live in peace. They also love food as well as drinking beer at the inns and of course spending time with family. Yep, the Shire is a typical town in rural England and Shire folk like people in the rural English village would live. Though people all over Europe of the time basically live like that, and this is the type of life Tolkien viewed as ideal. And quite frankly, so do I. Sometimes I just wish you could just live like that again without much concern for big global political issues and toxic people online. Gondor, the major kingdom of men, on the other hand, is very much based on Rome. Some of Gondor's history also takes a clear inspiration from the Byzantine Empire. Again, it's not a direct allegory, but inspiration is very much there, because a lot of it is actually Tolkien adding a lot of his own unique spin on. The southern cultures that fight Gondor, like the Easterlings and the Haradrim, take some inspiration from different cultures, non-European ones, from the real world, like Middle Eastern or African, for example. Tolkien disliked direct allegory, but there is no doubt how much inspiration from European history and mythology he took to create his own unique fantasy world. Of course, he gave a lot of his own personal unique ideas to create the perfect, beautiful, magical world of Middle-earth. When Peter Jackson chose to adapt the Lord of the Rings trilogy, he truly understood what was his job. He was stating a couple of times that he wasn't adapting his story, he was adapting Tolkien's story. He constantly kept saying that Lord of the Rings wasn't his story, it was only Tolkien's story alone. And as you are watching those movies and understand Tolkien and his writings, you get an even bigger appreciation for those movies. Of course, there is no doubt that there are indeed changes to the source material, but they were generally done in service of the medium that the story was being translated. But they weren't done to change the story or even give a spin on it. No, they were done purely out of pragmatic reasons for the medium. And the story of how those movies were actually created is an amazing story of its own that very much deserves to be told. In fact, it's such a fascinating story that it could even get its own movie appreciation and makes you appreciate those movies even more. Tolkien's books were for the longest time considered completely unfilmable, and Peter Jackson and his team wanted to direct those movies, and they went to Miramax Studio that just wanted to condense the story into one movie. But Peter Jackson and his team knew that the story by J.R.R Tolkien just wouldn't work for one movie. The Lord of the Rings books are 3 gigantic books telling a deep, rich, compelling story full of rich lore created by a man of passion and dedication. And what's more, Miramax also wanted to change Tolkien's story and make Frodo and Sam gay, but thankfully back then, Peter Jackson had none of that. He understood, as I said, that he wasn't writing his story, he was writing Tolkien's story. So he abandoned Miramax Studios and instead went to New Line Cinema. New Line Cinema created plenty of costumes for the movies, made really unique creature designs, and created all the sets, as well as hired best actors for the roles in the story, and gave a very large budget for all those movies. And if those movies failed, New Line Cinema would bankrupt. And yet, they still took this huge risk, which shows how much confidence and faith they actually had in those movies succeeding and how much their confidence paid off so well, because the Lord of the Rings trilogy is the greatest masterpiece in the history of cinema. The Lord of the Rings trilogy have everything that a great movie needs, and they go so much above and beyond all that. And first, they are faithfully based on an amazing source material, and as I've already been saying, Peter Jackson truly went to great lengths to make sure that this truly does represent Tolkien's work. And let's at first talk about the story of the Lord of the Rings itself and the universal themes of Tolkien books, in addition to everything I already said before, were also about regular folk rising and overcoming the impossible odds. Frodo Baggins is a regular hobbit from the Shire who inherits the Ring of Power from his uncle Bilbo Baggins, and as a result, the fate and balance of Middle-earth rests in Frodo's hands. Frodo has to embark on a dangerous quest to the dark land of Mordor and throw the ring into Mount Doom, the one place it can be destroyed. But Frodo isn't the only character. The story very much brims with fantastic characters with their own character arcs, such as Frodo's best friend Sam, and their friendship is one of the most compelling things in the story and one of the best friendships ever put on TV. Like, their friendship is so much better than almost any relationship in any modern movie. We all need a Sam in our life.
I made a promise, Mr. Frodo. A promise. Don't you leave him, Samwise Gamgee. And I don't mean to. I don't mean to. Oh, Sam.
And of course, there is everyone's favorite wizard, Gandalf. I mean, everyone would love to have a mentor like Gandalf, and sure, there were other very wise mentors in other stories, such as Dumbledore, as well as Obi-Wan Kenobi, But without Gandalf, none of them would have ever existed. Like, Gandalf very much set a precedent for such a wise mentor, and the movies have truly done Gandalf justice to how Tolkien very much wrote and envisioned him, and Ian McKellen was such a phenomenal pick to portray Gandalf, and also plenty of advice and quotes that Gandalf gives and offers can actually be wonderfully used when you're struggling with some actual big struggle in real life, like...
I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us.
But my favorite character is actually Aragorn, son of Arathorn, who's possibly my favorite character in all of fiction. And Aragorn is the rightful king of Gondor and the heir to Isildur. And together with Aragorn are his two best friends, an elf named Legolas, as well as a dwarf named Gimli. And Legolas and Gimli are actually prejudiced against each other at first, since they're an elf and a dwarf, and the elves and dwarves very much hate each other, but Legolas and Gimli over time become best friends, and their friendship is also so amazing and so well written, and the development of that friendship feels so much more natural than almost any relationship written in a modern movie.
I thought I'd die fighting side by side with an elf.
What about side by side with a friend?
And together with Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli form an amazing trio. The one change I think the movies actually have done better though than the books is the character of Boromir. In the movies, Boromir is one of the most compelling characters in the story, and definitely the most complex too. In the book, Boromir just feels as a character created to be killed off during the journey. While he has a similar role in the movie, he actually has been turned into my second favorite character, only next to aforementioned Aragorn. And character of Boromir is one of the few things I think that the movies have done better than the books. Boromir is a good man who very much deeply cares about his kingdom and people of Gondor, and he does want to take the ring and use it against the enemy, even though it doesn't work like that. But deep down, he's a good man who very much cares about doing the right thing, and some of his more negative traits are actually an influence of his father Denethor, the steward of Gondor. Denethor, on the other hand, is one of the most unlikable characters in the whole movies. He was actually far more complex and more likable in the books, but the movies completely stripped away all his more positive traits from the books. But Boromir, on the other hand, has been turned, as I said, into my second favorite character in the whole story. And as a result, that also makes his death scene one of the most tragic scenes in all three movies. And of course, there is one of my favorite villains of all time, Saruman the White. And Christopher Lee was such a perfect pick to play Saruman. And newsflash, he's also the only actor that actually met J.R.R Tolkien personally. And that leads me to one of the changes in the books that I really love it in the book, but I understand that for pragmatic reasons it had to be changed. Because in the books, when Saruman becomes corrupted and evil, he actually drops the Saruman the White persona and embraces the Saruman of many colors persona, which I really love. It basically represents the wizard's complete corruption, but the movies just keep him as Saruman the White, but that's a pragmatic change. After all, a multicolored robe would kind of look a little silly in a live-action movie. But that also brings me to a much bigger change, also involving Saruman, and that's the complete removal of Scouring of the Shire. Scouring of the Shire is one of my favorite parts in the book, and it's so thematic and perfectly consistent with Tolkien's themes. That said, the movies completely remove Scouring of the Shire, but that also makes perfect sense because it just doesn't work for the film format. The Return of the King already has a very long and extensive ending, which I really love, by the way. I think that such a very long with multiple fake out endings actually perfectly works for such an epic scale movie and epic scale story, so I love that. But just making another episode in the story, which is what Scouring of the Shire is, just doesn't work for the film format. Again, I really love Scouring of the Shire. It's one of my favorite parts of the books, and it's so perfectly consistent with Tolkien's themes. But the simple fact is, Scouring of the Shire operates on the format that the movies simply don't operate. But that said, that's the whole Scouring of the Shire and why its removal makes sense and why I love it so much is a topic for an entirely separate video. And that very much goes back to my point I said about the changes that Jackson made to Lord of the Rings. Those changes that he made were purely for the pragmatic reasons of the medium and nothing else. The visuals and landscapes in Lord of the Rings are beautiful and gorgeous. Peter Jackson specifically picked his native New Zealand to film those movies, and that was such a great choice. Like, this guy truly knew what he was doing, and I'm very sensitive to beautiful, gorgeous visuals, and I think The Lord of the Rings has the best ones in movies in all of history. Like, no movies ever combined wonderful visuals with fantastic storytelling better than The Lord of the Rings trilogy. And compare it to The Hobbit, which was so over-reliant on CGI and how plenty of things look so computer-generated. Let's also give a shout out to Howard Shore's Magnificence score. No conversation about The Lord of the Rings would be complete without talking about that amazing soundtrack, because the music feels like it has life of its own, and every single soundtrack is memorable and enhances an already fantastic story, and they're so well matched with what is happening in the movie. Just to name one of the soundtracks, just the theme of the Fellowship of the Ring. But in general, the excellence of the soundtrack is just hard to put into words. But Howard Shore was just born to give soundtrack to The Lord of the Rings. I already talked how large budget New Line Cinema gave Peter Jackson to create those movies, and all the variety of costumes and unique creature designs they created for those movies. Like, just look at Sauron. Like, the way he looks is just awesome. Sauron is a giant in black armor full of spikes everywhere. Like, he just looks excellent and much better than every single modern CGI villain, or every single villain really for that matter. And speaking of which, this is also one of the changes from the book that I really like, because it just works so perfectly for the movie medium. Like, in the book, Eye of Sauron is more like a symbol and something Sauron uses, but it's not Sauron himself. Peter Jackson chose to make it Sauron's actual form, which doesn't change the story but works very well for the movie medium, because the Eye of Sauron is just so awesome, and it's just so amazing that in the movie it is actually Sauron's actual physical form. I love that. And also, for example, look at the costumes of Haradrim. It's clearly inspired by Saracen's armor in the Crusades, and I already talked of Haradrim before and said how they were men of the south of Gondor, and according to Tolkien, they were inspired by Middle Eastern culture, but not just Middle Eastern culture, but various non-European cultures. Like, they also were inspired by African cultures as well. Again, Haradrim were just men of the south of Gondor, but still, I think Saracen-like costumes are just perfect for the Haradrim. The Easterlings, whom I also already mentioned, their armor, on the other hand, seems to take inspiration from some fancy ancient Persian armor, but mostly still given lots of personal imagination. And the orcs and the practical effects on them and the makeup, this is all splendid. Like, every orc looks so different from one another, and they also stand out apart from one another, and almost every orc is memorable, even if they had a very minor role. Contrast it to the orcs in The Hobbit. They all look so bland and practically all the same. The only ones that stand out are Azog the Defiler as well as his son Bolg. Again, I do think Azog and Bolg do look pretty cool, but they're the only two ones in The Hobbit, really. The rest of the orcs in The Hobbit all look so bland, as I said, but in Lord of the Rings, though, every single orc stands out. Whether he's the leader or just appears in a single scene, but it just feels like every single orc is distinct from another one. As already said before, even though J.R.R Tolkien famously disliked direct allegory, it can't be hidden that his Catholic faith very much played a role in his creation of the world of Middle-earth and in the stories. Like, we'll now briefly talk of that. Like, for example, the Silmarillion, which is basically a creation of the Middle-earth and all of that, like, it's basically very much the Bible of Middle-earth. And I haven't actually read all of the Silmarillion. I really wanna read the book someday from beginning to end, but yes, the Silmarillion is basically the Bible of Middle-earth. And in The Lord of the Rings, some characters could represent Jesus Christ, especially Frodo, Gandalf, or Aragorn. Like, whole story of Frodo Baggins could be seen as allegory of Jesus Christ carrying a cross upon the Calvary mountain. And of course, the ring is the burden. And also, whole theme of Return of the King could be seen as allegory of Jesus Christ. And of course, the greatest example of other Catholic themes could actually be the corrupting influence of the One Ring. Like, exposure to the One Ring can really drive anyone mad and evil. And powerful people like Gandalf and Galadriel outright refuse to take the ring because, while they might have desire to do good with it, the ring itself would wield power too terrible for them to imagine, and Boromir wanting to take the ring to Gondor and use it against the enemy. But, as Aragorn said, the ring answers to Sauron and Sauron alone.
None of us can. The One Ring answers to Sauron alone. It has no other master.
But the best example of the corruption of the ring is the story of Gollum and how he was corrupted by the ring. It completely destroyed him. Like, Gollum is a sympathetic villain then right. I don't really like the Hollywood insistence now of making almost all villains sympathetic now, but in Gollum's case, it completely makes sense. And besides, he isn't even the main villain of the story anyway, not even close. I mean, I guess you could say that he's the main villain for Frodo's personal story, but if anything, it further enhances the story and shows up what would have happened with Frodo had he lived with the ring as long as Gollum did. And that also brings us to one of my favorite quotes in history by Gandalf.
Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them, Frodo? Do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment.
What's interesting is, while I do very much consider The Lord of the Rings as very much a Catholic story, and so did Tolkien, it's such a well-written story that it can really be enjoyed by anyone. I mean, the corruption of the ring very much reflects human desire to sin, but it can also be seen as comparison to being addicted to drugs, like some teenagers around the world do get addicted, and they think that drugs are good for them, and that they will use them wisely, but drugs don't work like that, and sooner teenagers will get addicted and turn on their friends, family, and other people who close to them. The ring just corrupts.
But the hearts of men are easily corrupted.
Like aforementioned situation with Boromir. Like, Boromir is a good man, honorable man, who wants to bring peace to his people in Gondor and tries to take the ring and even attacks Frodo, whom he swore an oath to protect. The ring is an evil object that will corrupt even the most noble men. And that further makes Aragorn such an amazing character, and why he could also be seen as another character that's very much allegorical of Christ. Aragorn resists the temptation of the ring. Frodo offers Aragorn the ring, but Aragorn specifically rejects an offer despite being very much tempted by it, and that also contrasts him with his ancestor Isildur, who on the other hand fell victim to the ring. Isildur had one chance to destroy the ring forever, but he refused and himself got corrupted by it. Like, Aragorn literally does what his ancestor could not. And not only that, but as the rightful king of Gondor, Aragorn leads whole Middle-earth against forces of evil, even if he himself doesn't trust that he could be a good king, despite the fact that he very much proves himself to be a perfect king, like he exemplifies every trait that a good king should have. Still, the character who is probably the biggest Christ allegory in the story objectively is, of course, Gandalf. Like, he came back from the dead and rose more powerful than ever. Like, Gandalf was specifically resurrected to complete his mission. Gandalf is a teacher and a mentor, and as already talked before, he guides everyone, and without him, the Fellowship would just never succeed or even come close to destroying Sauron and the Ring. But what movie-only watchers might not know is that wizards in Middle-earth are actually divine beings sent by Eru Ilúvatar, the god of this world, and their mission is to guide mankind. Gandalf very much stays true to his mission, which also contrasts Gandalf with his former mentor, aforementioned Saruman. Saruman is basically Judas, who betrayed his mission of guidance in fighting evil in pursuit of power, and as a punishment, he pays the price with death. Still, Frodo, Aragorn, and Gandalf each represent a different element of Christ. But maybe now, enough talk of the religious elements. The movies also wonderfully explored plenty of other themes that Tolkien presented in his books, such as nature versus industrialization and technology. Saruman and his machines represent industrialization, which Tolkien very much hated. Tolkien very much preferred a quiet, peaceful life in a rural village with peace and quiet as opposed to a big city, and I can actually very much relate to that. I also very much prefer a village or a small town as opposed to big cities. Like here in Poland, I actually live in a small town, and when I lived in the United States for 8 years, I lived for 3 years in the ocean state of Rhode Island and then in rural Vermont. So yes, Saruman trying to burn Fangorn Forest and building his machines was Tolkien's vision against industrialization, and then ends attacking and destroying Isengard is Mother Nature taking her vengeance. You can't mess with nature. As I've been saying, that Tolkien very much disliked direct allegory, even though plenty of people did try to read his story as an allegory of World War II, but it doesn't change the fact that it could be seen as applicability to dark times in general, including the modern world, because as you're reading the Tolkien book or watching the movies, you can't help but relate it very much now to the modern world, which, if anything, is what makes this story even more special. It's a timeless story that could be related to plenty of situations in history and in generally the dark times, and the modern world is very much currently in dark times, because the story is largely ultimately a battle between good and evil, which does kind of resemble the modern real world, except that in The Lord of the Rings it's quite clear who is evil and who is good, but in the real world the lines are so much more blurred with how the mainstream media very much lies to the public and how tribal people of all political sides have largely become, especially in the America and Western Europe. Like I spoke a few weeks ago about the assassination of Charlie Kirk and the death of the innocent Ukrainian girl mass shooting in Colorado, or in general how corrupt politics has become, and again how tribal people are now and just see anyone who disagrees with them as evil. And like Lord of the Rings, the power between good and evil obviously depends on which political spectrum you are. Chances are you will likely label the side you disagree with as evil, because, and worse yet, these days also, you just can't trust anybody. Like a great quote I seen from someone, but I will call them anonymous, is that you can see the same story on different channels and there are just so many different narratives, and on social media you're going to get the stories that fit with what you want to believe based on the algorithm. You never get the true story, and this is very, very true. Like as I just said, you just can't trust anybody, not the mainstream media or any politician for that matter, and as I just said, both sides will present the same story from such a different perspective that you just don't know who to trust. And the conversation Gandalf has with Frodo in Moria, that I already did allude to a couple of times, is very much hopeful, and I truly can very much relate to things happening in the modern world with people. Frodo almost gives into despair, and actually, let me bring that quote once again, actually.
I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us.
And healthy thing is to just turn off the news and social media and focus on family and friends, as well as just doing the things you love in general. Because, as Sam said,
There's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo. And it's worth fighting for.
this is such an inspirational quote, and it should always be used whenever you feel negative about the modern state of the world right now, or if just something very negative is happening to you. The Lord of the Rings is such a timeless story, and it can be applied to the dark times happening in the world in general. The Lord of the Rings trilogy was made during the days where quality cinema was such a huge thing, because nowadays movies are generally just either spin-offs and also rely so much on CGI and special effects, worse yet shove political agenda, and worst of all, don't respect their audiences. Like Marvel Cinematic Universe, even in its glory days, even the greatest Marvel movies are just special effect candies next to quality movies that came out when I was a kid. Then we also had Pirates of the Caribbean, also among my favorite movies of all time, by the way, Harry Potter, Kingdom of Heaven, Troy, Gladiator, etc. And while those movies are all magnificent and certainly better than every single movie made today, I don't even think even any of those will ever match the quality of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Those movies aren't just movies, they are true works of art and passion. I watch them almost every year, actually, and sometimes when there are just some of those days where you browse through your DVD library and Netflix and all that and don't know what to watch, then you just think to yourself, why can't I just watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy once again? And they still manage to impress me, and I can still hardly comprehend their brilliance, and the story still just stays in my head weeks after watching them. And if you haven't seen them, please do yourself a favor and watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and better yet, read the books as well. And thank you folks for checking out this video, and please subscribe this channel and press the like button, and just remember, the Lord of the Rings trilogy is as close to pure perfection as you can get.